This is going to wind up a lot of people, but what can you do about it? Not here to make people feel comfortable. I'm here to tell the truth. Now, a statement's been signed by several indigenous rights organisations from 12 Commonwealth nations, ranging from New Zealand and St Vincent to Australia and St Kitts and Nevis to Canada and the Bahamas, demanding that King Charles III, who is, of course, having his big coronation this weekend, apologise for centuries of genocide and colonisation by the British Empire. They're demanding a formal apology for these centuries of racism, oppression, colonialism and slavery, and for reparatory justice to commence. Now, they're also demanding the return of all our cultural treasures and artefacts stolen from our peoples throughout the hundreds of years of genocide, enslavement, discrimination, massacre, and racial discrimination by the authorities empowered by the protection of the British Crown, and the reparation of all remains of our collective peoples that reside in UK museums and institutions and that represent our family histories, genealogies, cultural history, and spiritual ancestry. Good. Absolutely reasonable stuff. Completely fair. If it was the other way around. And the sort of people who get angry about this had been on the receiving end of colonisation, and their treasures had been stolen by a foreign empire which had stolen their resources, pillaged their country, and oversaw mass murder on a truly horrific scale. They would also support the same thing. It is important, this, because we haven't had a reckoning in this country about our past, which is a precondition to understanding our present and all of the many injustices that define the present in which we live. Now, there has been no attempt to come to terms with the reality of the British Empire, which is not taught properly in schools, which is not properly discussed and debated in public in Britain. In 2020, a YouGov poll found that 32% of British citizens thought the British Empire was more something to be proud of than not. 37% thought neither something to be proud of nor ashamed of, and 19% said something to be ashamed of. Those 19% of people are absolutely correct. That is a mortifyingly low level of support for the correct position on this, because the British Empire oversaw some of the great horrors of human history. The conquering of peoples, the murder and pillaging, the theft of land and resources, not something to be proud of, something to be ashamed of. And these indigenous leaders are correct. The monarchy, given its long association with the empire, very much, you can't disentangle the empire and the crown, and the vast wealth it specifically accumulated because of the empire. Let's just take one example, the British rule of India. Now, before the British took over, India was relatively very prosperous. It was what became the jewel of the crown, of course, of the British Empire. But at the beginning of the 18th century, before it was conquered, its share of the world economy was well over a fifth, nearly the same as all of Europe put together. By the time the country won independence, that dropped to less than 4% of the world economy. It was a cash cow for the British Empire. Indeed, a truly disturbing but fascinating study by a renowned economist, Utsa Patnaik, estimates that Britain stole the equivalent of nearly $45 trillion between 1765 and 1938 from India. That's 17 times more than the total GDP of the United Kingdom today. A vast sum of money stolen from India by the British Empire. That was through his work uncovered through the textile system, where the East India Company began collecting taxes in India, used around a third of the revenues to fund the purchase of Indian goods for British use. So the British didn't pay for those goods with their own cash, but got them for free. Mass theft. And his argument, correctly, is that Britain didn't develop India, but rather it was the other way round, that India developed Britain. I mean, by the end of the 19th century, India was the world's biggest buyer of British exports and provided hugely highly paid work for British civil servants, all at the expense of India. It was described, the revenues that flowed into London's treasury by the Earl of Chatham, as the redemption of a nation, a kind of gift from heaven. It wasn't a gift, it was just mass theft. Now, there was a catastrophic human cost to the British rule of India. Millions of Indians died completely unnecessary deaths. Over a decade ago, Mike Davis wrote a seminal book called Late Victorian Holocausts. And as a result of laissez-faire economic policies he found imposed by the British, between 12 and 29 million Indians died of starvation needlessly. Millions of tons of wheat were exported to Britain even as famine raged. When relief camps were set up, the inhabitants were barely fed and nearly all died. Now, if we correctly condemn Chairman Mao for the mass famine of the Great Leap Forward, we have to do the same with the British Empire in India. But we hold Maoism to account with all its horrors in terms of the Great Leap Forward and the millions who died in that famine. But we don't talk about the British system of colonialism, which was very much integral to British capitalism. There's so many other examples. So we could think of, for example, Lord Kitchener, before he helped send hundreds of thousands of working class Brits to their deaths in World War One, but he led a brutal campaign to seize Sudan. And as the historian Piers Brendan put it, British punitive expeditions in Sudan were extremely brutal, at times amounting to almost genocide. There was the Mau Mau Rising as recently as the 1950s in Kenya, which even Enoch Powell condemned at the time, which is, a brutal crackdown of the Mau Mau uprising, where thousands of members of the Kikuyu tribe were driven into detention camps, described by the Harvard historian Caroline Elkins as Britain's Gulag. One estimate put the death toll at 20,000. Elkins believes up to 100,000 could have died. These were horrendous crimes on a mass scale. Now, specifically, we heard, of course, about Australia, in terms of indigenous leaders there signing this letter. Well, of course, the British unleashed terrible, unspeakable horrors against the Aboriginal people, the destruction of the First Nations of Australia. Slavery. Now, what often comes up here is just talk of British abolishing slavery and that being a great, proud moment. It's a bit like a serial killer who just kills vast numbers of people, but then stops killing them and goes, well, see, I should get credit for that. I've stopped killing vast numbers of people. Between the 1560s and 1833, it's estimated Britain transported more than 3 million Africans to the UK colonies, many of whom died. It was estimated maybe about 20% of slaves who were transported in unspeakably barbaric conditions died. That 3 million is about a quarter of all the slaves the Europeans kidnapped in that period. By the 18th century, Britain had become the most important slave nation on earth. And that, if you look at many cities across Britain, I'm particularly thinking of places like London, Bristol, Liverpool, and so on, these great ports where slaves were transported. A lot of the wealth of those cities was built on slavery. We could go in terms of the artefacts that have been mentioned as well. British museums, of course, are full of loot. Colonial loot, just stolen from countries which are subjugated. Like the hundreds of bronze sculptures stolen from Nigeria and the British Empire looted. They just looted the then Kingdom of Benin. The Rosetta Stone stolen from Egypt. And the Koh-i-Noor on the King's crown, that big crown that's going to be placed on King Charles III's head, which has one of the largest cut diamonds of the world, stolen from India. We have to come to terms with our past because we won't understand our present. You can't understand how racism functions today because racism was used and developed to justify treating black people as inferior to rationalise their subjugation, their enslavement and their colonisation. You can't understand many of the conflicts which rage across the world, the huge amounts of poverty that still define so much of these poorer nations, all because of the legacy of the British Empire. So during this coronation, I'm glad this letter has been signed by indigenous leaders who are trying to force us to come to terms with our history. We haven't done that. I bet, I'm not saying this to be like, oh, Lord, look at me, giving you all these facts and knowledge. How many of you knew about how much I just spoke about? And this is just one sample of Britain's history. How much did you actually know about the detail of what I just said? Do you see what I mean? We don't think about our own history, and that a lot then of the kind of chauvinism and the problematic forms of nationalism that exist in this country are allowed to take root and spread, partly because we don't come to terms with our history. We haven't held up a mirror to what we did, what our ancestors did. I know a lot of people go, well, I didn't do these things. Of course, I'm not holding, people go, oh, why are we being held responsible? We weren't even alive at the time. No, but we've got to understand the vast wealth that exists in this nation. So much of it was just stolen from people around the world. So therefore, when we look at Britain's place in the world today and how it behaves, how it continues to behave, look at things like the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan for 2 decades in this century, and Afghanistan previously the site of British colonial doomed expeditions, it should be said. We have to come to terms with what we did as a nation and understand how the nation that we live in was created, understand the role of the monarchy and the crown in these horrors, because otherwise we don't understand our present, and that will allow, I would argue, many horrors to continue in the future as well. So yes, I think King Charles III should apologise for the behaviour of his institution that he's part of, and he enjoys vast wealth as a consequence of the actions of the British Empire, which we do need to come to terms with. Please like, subscribe, and do support us on patreon.com/OwenJersey. I'll see you in a bit.